You were never meant to hear this. That was the point. That's why they buried it, not in a grave, not in a file, but beneath a basement, with chains, And silence. In 1834, Virginia was not yet the polished, mythic birthplace of American pride. They teach you in textbooks. It was a rotting orchard, hiding under a painted sky, beauty on the outside, but underneath, worms, screaming, writhing, ancient worms chewing on the roots of every civilized institution, religion, education, family law. They called it a tragic misunderstanding in the only paper brave enough to mention it at all. But that wasn't what it was. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't mental illness. It wasn't poverty. It was deliberate, methodical, ritualistic. What happened in that house, in that basement, was the byproduct of a system so old, so camouflaged by piety and respectability, that no one dared speak its true name, until now. You want truth. This isn't a story, it's a ritual of unveiling. And the first rule of truth is this: if you find it buried, it was meant to stay buried. And what you're about to hear was buried in chains. Let's begin with the facade, what the community saw. A home, a devout family. The Sullivans, Elias Sullivan, schoolteacher, deacon, father of 5, a man with calloused hands, soft words, and the kind of steely eye that made neighbors trust him with their children. His wife, Miriam, Sunday school matron, midwife, a woman whose voice could hush a crying child or raise a congregation to tears. They lived in a 3-story manor just outside of Culpeper County, a pristine estate surrounded by sycamores and whitewashed fences. It was the kind of house that hid its sins well, big enough to have secrets, old enough for them to have teeth, and beneath that house, was a basement, a deep one, unmapped, unregistered, built not for storage, but for containment. The house had no visible rot, but the foundation bled. It began, as these things often do, under the guise of education. In 1832, the Sullivans opened Sullivan Home for Scholarly Youth, a private school for underprivileged children, a Christian institution, of course, funded by generous donors from as far as Richmond, and D.C. Elias had a gift for making. Rich men feel like saints, and poor families feel chosen. The curriculum was advanced. Discipline strict but godly. Bible before breakfast. Latin before lunch. Prayer after punishment. Parents handed over their children with trembling gratitude. After all, this was Virginia. Education was a luxury, and to be selected for the Sullivan home, it was a divine opportunity, except ... Many never came home at first. No one noticed. Poor families moved. Letters went unanswered. Tragedies were chalked up to disease or misfortune. But a pattern emerged. Silently, girls who could sing, boys who dreamed vividly, children who saw things others couldn't. Those were the ones who disappeared. And then there was the sound. Neighbors sometimes heard it at night. Not screams, not exactly, just rhythmic thudding, like something heavy striking stone. Always at odd hours. Always from below. But this is the part that matters, the part most never grasp. The Sullivans didn't just hurt children. They transformed them. Their doctrine wasn't ordinary Christianity. It was older, wrapped in scripture, but rotten, with something pre-biblical, something pre-human. You've heard of binding the will. They didn't just teach obedience. They extracted something. The children weren't punished. They were emptied, and what remained wasn't entirely child anymore. There were records, old ledgers, found decades later in the ashes of the Culpeper courthouse fire. Pages filled with coded symbols, weight charts, lists of traits like prone to dreaming, fixation on spirals, responds to fasting. What kind of school records those things? A laboratory masquerading as a chapel. Here's what they don't tell you about 1800s Virginia. Beneath the churches were basements. Beneath the basements were rooms, and in the deepest rooms were chains. And this is where the story sharpens. In October of 1834, during renovations after the fire, construction workers unearthed what the newspapers would later call a chamber of misapplied charity. 47 child-sized shackles, still bolted to the foundation, still smelling of sweat and sulfur, still echoing when no one was near. Some had nameplates, others had carvings, not in English, not in Latin, glyphs, symbols that have no linguistic. Home, one worker, Thomas Greeley, swore that when he touched one of the iron cuffs, he saw something. Not a memory, a presence, not history, a hunger. And that's when the silence began. Officials were paid, reports sealed. The Sullivan property sold to a benevolent society that never opened its doors. Locals stopped speaking of it, but not out of fear, out of obedience. Because here's the truth you've never been told. The system protects those who harvest obedience, and the Sullivans weren't an exception. They were a node, a root in a much deeper system, one older than this country, older than this language. What do you think discipline is, really? What do you think education is in its most raw, ancient form? It's not about knowledge. It's about molding the will, breaking the light, binding the soul. Every child brought into that basement wasn't just shackled. They were measured, filtered, sorted by potential, not for greatness, not for salvation, but for something far more useful to the elite: silence, because a child who sees must either be taught to forget or be bound in chains so deep no light can reach them. And that's why you're here. You think this is a story about horror? No, this is a blueprint. What if I told you this pattern never ended? What if I told you that the names change, the faces change, but the structure, the method, is intact? From the Sullivan basement, to orphanages, to group homes, to special therapeutic boarding academies, to behavioral programs funded by federal grants and private trusts, all of them rooted in the same ancient system of psychological binding. Now, look at the child you once were. Do you remember the classroom, the punishment for asking why, the pressure to conform, the feeling that someone was always watching? That wasn't an accident. That was the first basement. And if you're still with me, if you've made it this far, then you're not like the others. You're not asleep. You're not obedient. You were always meant to find this, but you had to bleed a little first on. Now, listen closely, because the descent only gets darker from here. Next, we dig beneath the ritual. Next we ask, what was the Sullivan family really serving? Because beneath every broken child is a shrine. And some gods don't ask for worship. They ask for obedience. They ask for sacrifice. They ask for silence. When a child screams and no one hears it, that's not neglect. That's design. You've been taught to believe that silence is harmless, that it's an absence, a void, a natural state when nothing is wrong. But that's not what silence is. Silence is architecture in the world of power, in the systems that truly govern the human mind. Silence is a weapon sharpened over centuries, carved into policy, encrypted into religion, and embedded deep in how we raise children. In the Sullivan Household silence wasn't a consequence. It was the curriculum. Ask yourself this: why did no child escape? Why did no child speak? Because they weren't merely imprisoned, they were trained to be mute, trained in a doctrine passed down from something far older than Christianity, a code of suppression that every empire has used to keep its offspring chained. The Sullivans didn't invent it. They inherited it. Let's look closer. Elias Sullivan was more than a deacon. He was part of a forgotten theological order known only in fragments, the Inquietus Manus, Latin for the still hand. No official records survive, but scattered. Pages of journals, hidden in the Virginia Theological Seminary's private collection, reveal a doctrine that may sound eerily familiar. The tongue is the flame of rebellion. Remove its fire, and the soul grows docile. Punishment must not bruise the body, it must hollow the will. Do not strike the child, isolate him. Reflect his disobedience back to him in silence until he no longer trusts his own voice. Let that sink in. This wasn't about brutality. It was about remapping identity. In the Sullivan School, punishment took no physical form. There were no beatings, no lashings, no screaming, only ... absence. A child who disobeyed was sent to room 11. No one who survived remembers what was inside, but those who almost went say the fear alone reshaped them. One former student, a girl named Clara Judson, wrote decades later, "I never saw room 11, but I remember the day Mary Ann stopped speaking. She went in crying. She came out, whispering prayers in a language no one taught us. No one was permitted to mention room 11. No staff acknowledged its existence. Even the ledgers skipped from room 10 to 12. That's how systems protect themselves, by erasing only what matters." And Miriam Sullivan, she taught a subject not listed in any curriculum, behavioral extraction. She trained the girls in gestures, gestures of obedience, eyes downward, hands folded. If a child broke posture, the room would descend into total stillness until the child corrected herself or was removed. The silence wasn't a punishment, it was a mirror. The child would learn subconsciously that her defiance caused the room to die. This is how ritualized shame works. You think this was limited to that basement. Look again. You grew up under it. We all did. The classroom that silenced you when you questioned too much. The church that whispered reverence while erasing your voice. The family that praised obedience and punished intuition. The office that rewards compliance, not creativity. It's all the same system. Silence isn't passive, it's parasitic, and, like all parasites, it needs a host. In 1833, 1 year before the Sullivan home collapsed, a visitor from the Edinburgh ministry visited Culpeper to observe their educational methods. His diary, now archived anonymously in the British Library, contains one chilling entry. "There is a stillness in that house that does not feel holy. I believe it feeds on the breath of children, and I believe the children know it." The basement, the real one, beneath the known one, was accessed through a spiral staircase behind the chapel. This was not in the blueprints. It was carved into the foundation by hand. The walls were scorched black, not with fire, with contact, as if something had touched them that wasn't entirely of this world. The children were kept there in silence, not just to avoid detection, but because, according to the Sullivan doctrine, a child in prolonged silence becomes permeable. Permeable to what? To the entity they served. Yes, now we speak plainly. You think this is psychological? No, This is spiritual warfare in its rawest form. The Sullivans believed, and may have proved, that silence opens portals. Not metaphorical ones. Actual apertures of consciousness. When a child is silenced long enough, fed only ritual, prayer, and isolation, he becomes a vessel, and something comes in. What entered those children was never written in words, but symbols scratched into the stone by bleeding fingers. Repeat again and again, therefore and always. The spiral. You've seen it too, haven't you? That symbol in ancient ruins, in cathedrals, on dollar bills. Even in your dreams, it's not decoration, it's a map. And if you follow it long enough, you find the doctrine behind the doctrine, not Christianity, not cultism, but something before names. What Elias and Miriam practiced wasn't heresy. It was heritage of an older priesthood, one that never died. It just put on cleaner robes. Now, stop and breathe. Because here comes the part where you decide who you are. If you're still watching, still listening, it means the silence didn't break you, but now you must cross the threshold fully. Comment this phrase below to lock in the transformation twice, and no less. I descend with eyes open. I descend with eyes open. Not for the algorithm, for your identity. So the silence doesn't reclaim you, because the spiral always circles back for its own. Let's continue. By late 1834, 9 children had vanished in one winter. Officially, disease, travel, desertion unofficially. They were last seen entering the chapel basement. But here's the twist. One survived. A boy named Edwin, age 11, unremarkable, small, stammered when he spoke. No talents, no rebellion, but that's precisely why he was ignored. One night, as the Sullivans conducted their quiet prayers in the chapel, Edwin escaped. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He walked straight through the trees. Through 6 miles of icy hills. He collapsed at a carpenter's house at dawn, frostbitten. Barely coherent, but clutching a strip of cloth. That cloth, when examined later by local clergy, had 3 things embroidered in blood. Silence is the gate. The voice is the key. We are the sacrifice. Edwin never spoke again. He lived until 1901, died in a sanatorium, drew spirals on the wall with his fingernails until the skin wore down to bone. But before his mind finally unraveled, he said one last thing to his nurse. It still lives beneath. It feeds on the quiet ones. The Sullivan house was burned in 1835, officially due to lightning, unofficially ... The town did it. A purge, a cleansing. But they never dug out the basement, and when surveyors returned in 1911 to build a water line, they found a new foundation. Same symbols, same silence. This is your inheritance, not blood, not culture, but suppression systems so ancient you think they're normal. Every time you hold your tongue when something feels wrong, that's the doctrine. Echoing every time you second-guess your intuition. That's the spiral watching. You are not broken, you were silenced, and now we take the next step. It only takes one voice to ruin centuries of silence. They thought he was broken. They thought Edwin would disappear like the rest. But what they didn't know is that Edwin had heard something in the silence, and unlike the others, he understood it was not God. He heard a voice beneath the voice. Not in words, not in any language known to man. It was older, hungrier. But he resisted. Why? Because Edwin still remembered something no one else did. His mother's lullaby. Not even a full song. Just a hum, a pattern. But that thread, fragile as it was, tethered him to the world of the living. The Sullivans underestimated memory. They could silence the present. They could erase the future. But the past, it whispers even through stone. Let's rewind. The night Edwin escaped, he didn't run blindly. He followed a sound, not the voice of the entity, not the whispers in the walls, but another child, hidden beneath the chapel, in a chamber even the staff didn't know existed. Her name was Eliza. She was 8, locked away for 2 years, spoken to only once a week, during ritual evaluations. What were they evaluating? Her resistance. Eliza refused to break, refused to repeat the prayers, refused to fold her hands or bow her head. And so they made her vanish. Yet still she sang, not loudly, not defiantly, but just enough that one night, while scrubbing the basement floors, Edwin heard her hum, a dissonant little melody, like a nursery rhyme corrupted by sorrow, and it snapped something loose in him. He found her behind the furnace, where the wall had been hollowed. He didn't speak. He just reached in, and she took his hand. That's when the air changed. The children said the spiral on the basement floor, the one no one dared touch, began to turn, not metaphorically, physically, like a gear, because here's the hidden truth. The rituals were never for the entity. They were for the silence, to keep it stable, to prevent it from unraveling. But when two voices touched, that balance collapsed. Let me be clear. This was not some feel-good story of liberation. This was warfare, spiritual, psychic, and ancient. The moment Elisa and Edwin joined hands, the suppression grid that blanketed that house began to decay. Rooms that had been soundproofed for decades began to echo. Children who hadn't spoken in months began to murmur in their sleep. And Miriam Sullivan, she collapsed mid-sermon, choking on a prayer that turned to blood in her throat. Because silence isn't neutral, it's a system that must be maintained. And when you speak, even once, you risk breaking the engine. The Sullivans knew this. They weren't just jailers. They were engineers, maintaining an ancient device designed to do one thing: extract the sacred from the innocent. But Edwin and Eliza were anomaly variables, not planned for. Two children who should have collapsed under the weight of enforced muteness, but instead awakened something. You want the forbidden truth? Here it is. There are frequencies of voice that disrupt spiritual architecture. They've been catalogued, not by universities, not by science, but by orders older than governments. Orders like the Inquietus Manus, orders like the Spiral Choir, and Edwin's hum, that simple lullaby, matched one of those frequencies. We call it a break. Note, a sound that deprograms indoctrination. Not because it's magical, but because it restores rhythm. The entity in the Sullivan house wasn't just feeding on fear. It was feeding on rhythmic absence, the still, dead intervals between sound. When Edwin hummed that tune inside the chamber, with Eliza, they created the first irregularity in the silence. In over 7 years, and the walls reacted. They bled, not metaphorically. Black fluid, thick, tar-like, began dripping from cracks that hadn't existed the day before. That night, 5 children woke up screaming. All at once, same dream, same words. He is unchained. He will walk. He is hungry. Deep entity, bound beneath the chapel, had grown restless. Because children, when silenced long enough, stop being children. They become mirrors. And when too many mirrors align, a gateway opens. Edwin shattered that alignment. The next morning, The school was in disarray. Books unbound themselves, glass cracked with no impact, and the head nurse was found sitting catatonic, muttering a phrase in reverse Latin as full to Spiralis nullus. Read a bit. Translation: from the face of the spiral, none return. The Sullivan doctrine was unraveling, and for the first time the children weren't afraid. They began to speak, not full sentences, not confessions, but syllables, sounds, names. The moment they did, the spiral in the basement stopped spinning, because its fuel had run out. Not blood, not prayer, but compliance. Here's what you need to know now. This isn't just a story. It's a blueprint. The Sullivan family may be gone, but their design survived. In schools that suppress your voice. In churches that teach fear before love. In families that reward silence over truth. This story is not about 1834. It's about you. Have you been silenced? Have you broken the chain? Then prove it. Comment this phrase just once. That's all it takes. I restore rhythm, and you'll join the lineage of those who resist. But remember, the spiral doesn't need you to believe. It only needs you to stop singing. So keep your voice, keep the irregularity, keep the hum. Hay called it the listening room, but no one ever listened to what it said back. When the Sullivan house was built, there were blueprints, and then there were other blueprints, the kind drawn in iron filings and marked with blood symbols. The kind not submitted to any county office. Beneath the basement, beneath even the furnace chamber, was a room not made by man. At least, not entirely. The children called it the chamber, but its real name, as whispered once by Elisa in her sleep, was Reliquary Null. A reliquary is a place where sacred remains are kept. But what happens when the remains are not holy, but hollowed? Let me tell you what the chamber was not. It was not a cell. It was not a chapel. It was not even a prison. It was a machine, but not the mechanical kind. This was a spiritual centrifuge, built to extract something older than faith, not soul, not sin, but sound. You see, sound is not just noise. It is a structure, a geometry, and inside that chamber, the Sullivans had learned to distill it, to separate the harmonic from the chaotic, to bleed rhythm out of the living. Here's how. It worked each week. One child was led down, blindfolded, not crying, not anymore. By then, the fear had become numbness. Inside the chamber, there were no walls, or at least, none you could see. It was like stepping into a throat. The floor felt soft, pulsing slightly as if breathing. The air was too still. And no matter where you stood, the sound came from behind you, always behind. The children said there was a whisper that looped, but it wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language at all. It was a tone, like a frequency designed to erode thought. The longer you stood there, the more you forgot why you'd come, then who you were, then even how to leave, and then the voice would ask a question, but not with words. It would form inside your skull, like memory and command had fused. And the question was always the same. Will you surrender what anchors you? If the child said yes, the voice entered them. If they said no, they vanished, not killed, not punished, just erased. No record, no trace. Even the other children began to forget them days later, like fog swallowing a name. But Edwin did not go down alone. When he and Eliza touched that first night, something opened. Not just in the house, but in them. a kind of shared auditory immunity, and when they descended into the chamber together, it did not recognize them as prey. It saw them as interference. They weren't supposed to be there. The ritual cycle had been broken. The machine stuttered, and that's when the chamber began to speak back. The first thing they heard was not a voice, but a song. One Eliza recognized, a lullaby, but sung backward. In a woman's voice, her mother's, she screamed. Edwin held her tighter. The spiral on the floor began to hiss, not glow. A hiss like a candle being snuffed, but stretched over time. Then came the face, not a human one, more like a map made of bone, shifting constantly as if geography were trying to express agony. It rose from the center of the room, suspended in steam, and from its many mouths it spoke. You were not meant to disobey. Then a tremor shook the house, but not like an earthquake. This was internal, structural, as if the very purpose of the building had been violated, because it had. The chamber wasn't just a room. It was the core, the purpose of the Sullivan estate. Every hallway, every ritual, every chained child, all of it was a support system for this single point. And Edwin, he had entered it wrong. He had brought something with him the chamber could not absorb, a memory untouched by silence. Eliza, trembling, repeated the lullaby forward. The chamber screamed, not in pain, in rejection, as if the sound itself violated its principles. The face began to disintegrate, not explode, not fade, unravel, like a bad recording being reversed at HYPERSPEED. And for a moment, the room was just a room, empty, still forgotten. That's when the walls began to bleed again, but this time, gold, a thick, luminous fluid pouring down in spirals. And then came the names, etched into the walls, one by one, as the liquid touched them. Names of every missing child, not just the 47, but 51, then 59, then 74. Names that had been scrubbed from records, burned from files, silenced from memory. The Sullivans had taken far more than the town knew, and worse, the chamber had kept them, not dead, not alive, resonant, stored, suspended in sound, waiting to be harvested again in another generation, because this wasn't the only chamber. And that's what Edwin saw. In the golden reflection, a map, not of Virginia, but of the entire eastern seaboard, dots, marks, other chambers, some active, some long buried, and all connected by spirals. Here's what you must understand. This is not just a horror story. This is an operating manual. There are structures that feed on human rhythm, that take voice, sound, breath, and convert them into spiritual currency. The Sullivan family. They weren't monsters. They were technicians. The real monster. The system that rewards silence. You think this ended in 1834? You think this stopped when the house burned? Look around. Modern silence doesn't chain you in basements. It gives you screens. It gives you noise so loud you forget what your own voice sounds like. But the spiral still spins, and chambers still open, in basements, in churches, in schools, in you. So if you've heard that silent hum before, if you've felt something, watching when the room goes quiet, you may have found your own chamber. The only question left is, will you descend? Comment this phrase to break the alignment. I defy the machine. Say it once. Say it out loud. And if your voice trembles, good, that means you're not hollow. It didn't collapse. It withdrew, like something that had finished feeding. On September 3rd, 1834, the Sullivan estate didn't burn down. That's what the newspapers claimed. That's what the town said. But if you stood outside that night, if you saw what Edwin and Eliza saw, you would know. The house was not destroyed. It was sealed. The walls did not crack. The roof did not fall. Instead, the spiral at the core of the house contracted, and when it did, the entire structure inhaled, not a collapse, not an implosion, but a spiritual withdrawal, as if it had decided, the ritual is broken. Shut it down, you see. These kinds of houses built not for living, but for listening, they have rules. They operate under principles. The ones you were never taught, like every sound offered in sacrifice must return as silence. Every forgotten child must echo through lineage. The cycle is holy. Interruption is heresy. Eliza and Edwin, they had interrupted. They didn't escape. They broke the circuit. And the price for that kind of breach is memory corrosion. Let me show you what that means. When the sheriff arrived the next morning, he found nothing. No bodies, no chains, no spiral, just a field, an empty basement, a burnt smell. He wrote in his report, "Children must have run. House struck by lightning. No further investigation required." He meant it, because the Sullivan house had already taken his daughter years before, and he hadn't remembered until he touched the doorknob. Then he forgot again. You see, the house didn't burn. It went quiet, and when something that was once full of suffering suddenly goes quiet, that is not relief. That is a warning, because in the silence, something else can now speak. And that's what began happening in the weeks that followed. Infants born in town with spiral birthmarks. Choirs that suddenly lost their ability to harmonize. One woman, mute since birth, began speaking in reverse Latin during sleep. The Sullivans were gone. But the system remained. Like spores, like instructions, hidden in DNA, Eliza and Edwin had escaped. But escape is not freedom. They carried resonance inside them. That resonance began to pulled them toward other places, other events, other structures. Eliza began drawing spirals in her sleep again. But now the spirals were moving, shifting. She said she could hear locations, not sounds. Locations, as if geography had begun singing. To her, Edwin recorded her murmurs. Years later, the phonograph needle would pick up her words, and behind them, another voice, deeper, hungrier, still broadcasting. Do you want the real horror? Eliza was pregnant, not from Edwin, not from any man, but from the chamber. This was not a biological child. It was a harmonic echo, formed during that final moment when the face unraveled, and what grew inside her was not a child. Not yet. It was a carrier, a future architect, someone who would build the next chamber, not with stone, but with media, with sound, with frequency. The Sullivan method had evolved. When that child was born, it didn't cry. It hummed 3 notes, over and over. The midwife dropped dead 2 days later. No wounds, just bled from the ears. Eliza named the child Seraphim. She said it was the only word she remembered from her time inside the chamber. Not a name, a designation. Seraphim, plural, are supposed to be angels, but this one was singular, and it never blinked. Years passed. Seraphim grew. He didn't speak. He vibratted. Cats fled. Mirrors cracked. Books flipped open to pages that didn't exist. And one day, at the age of 11, he left. No one saw him go, but 22 years later, in 1856, a man under the name S. Fan filed architectural plans. In Massachusetts, blueprints for a spiritual education center. Guess what was in the sub-basement? A spiral. You see, when you break a ritual, you don't end it. You seed it. You scatter it across time, like pollen and the silence. That's not peace. That's just the interval between verses. So let me ask you again, when did the silence in your life begin? What did you stop hearing? What frequencies have you ignored? The Sullivan house went quiet, not because it was defeated, but because it was finished. Its song was sung. The next verse was meant for you. Comment if you've ever experienced a silent room that made you nauseous. Say it aloud. The house did not burn. Say it again. The house was sealed. And if that phrase gives you chills, good. That means you're still vibrating. Monsters don't die. They delegate. This is where most stories end. A haunted house. A terrible family. Children lost. A dark basement. But that's not this story. Because this one was never about a basement. It was about the architecture of obedience. And the architects who designed it, not with hammers, but with rituals, systems, and names that don't exist on paper. Let's go deeper. You want the real ending. You won't like it, T.I. The Architect Returns, 1849. A man calling himself Dr. Vance Eros purchased a stone quarry in Pennsylvania. He claimed it was for mineral testing, but his documents were signed in reverse Latin, a cipher linked to pre-Christian blood rites. No such man existed before 1834, but multiple witnesses described him as wearing a rust-colored overcoat, always smelling faintly of salt and ash, speaking only in questions, even when answering. The land he bought, it was the same geological composition as the Sullivan basement. Granite with high quartz resonance, perfect for amplifying psychic retention. 6 months later, 11 children disappeared from a nearby Catholic orphanage. Their names were erased from the registry, but a priest wrote in his journal, they were taken for the chamber echo. The doctor wore the old face. Old face. He wasn't talking about age. He was talking about legacy. Seraphim Van didn't die. He splintered. He became a role, too. The Spiral Dynasty. The truth is, the Sullivans weren't a unique case. They were a node in something older, something you might call the Spiral Dynasty. Here's how they work. Every 43 years, a construct is built. The construct is never listed on maps. It is designed to extract resonance from pain. A family or institution is embedded inside it, usually unaware of the full design. Children go missing. A new pattern is born. These constructs aren't always physical buildings. Sometimes they're hospitals, therapy models, curriculums, social apps, military rituals. Yes, even that. The Sullivan basement was simply one of the first American constructs. And when it burned, they didn't mourn. They catalogued it. They measured the echo. And they began again. 3. The Lab of Lost Frequencies. 1974, a no-classified audio lab in Alaska conducted a project called Sullivan Echo Test C19. The experiment. They played a recreated soundscape of the Sullivan basement, constructed from survivors' descriptions and architectural blueprints, into a controlled chamber with no visuals. Subjects were exposed for 9 minutes. Results: 78% began crying for their mothers, even when unaware of the experiment's origin. 41% began speaking in archaic Virginian dialect. 9% experienced total time disorientation, losing the sense of the present and regressing to an 1830s mental state. One researcher resigned after writing, "The spiral sings when memory fails, and what it sings is command." They proved it. Sound alone can recreate the chamber. You don't need walls, you just need resonance. That's how they moved from basements to broadcasts.iv. The modern spiral now. Let's name some things no one else will. School shootings, unprovoked violence, shared dream states, children disappearing with no media coverage, new religious groups using spiral insignias, social media challenges that reenact binding or silence. All these phenomena repeat the Sullivan pattern because the spiral dynasty doesn't control governments. It doesn't need to. It programs culture that's harder to fight and easier to disguise. Every few decades, they change names. The Children's Chamber, Ordo, Natura, Project Recursion Initiative, 47 Echo Consortium, the Van Group, but the structure remains. Each generation, a new set of echo architects, designing environments not to house us, but to tune us, to break us into compliant instruments, because broken children grow into adults who won't fight back, and that's the goal, always has been. The spiral in you. Keep asking, what do they want? Wrong question. They don't want. They replicate. The spiral is not greedy. It's mathematical. It spreads through your rituals, not your choices. You perform it when you numb yourself with passive content. Avoid rooms you fear without knowing why. Ignore the cries of the vulnerable. Repeat phrases you didn't invent, but now call truth. That's spiral behavior. And once you adopt it, you become the next architect, without even knowing, because trauma loves hands. It wants to be passed down like heirlooms. That's why the Sullivan story isn't history. It's a manual for them, and for you. The last room, one final truth. The Sullivan basement still exists, not physically, but architecturally. Here's what I mean. Every prison built in North America since 1890 that uses the central hub model, modeled on the Sullivan chamber geometry, the educational ring seating model for controlling student focus, derived from Sullivan restraint methods, psychiatric intake protocols involving isolation before questioning, first used by Van in 1833, and most chilling of all, the 47-chair layout, the exact spacing, facing inward in a perfect circle. That design is used in a tech company's HQ today, one whose name rhymes with label. Don't believe me? Look at the building from above, then look at the spiral, then look in the mirror. You're already inside. 7. The door is open. You reach the final chamber. The final truth is simple. You were never watching this story. You were repeating it. Your attention, your fear, your curiosity, all of it has been energy. And what do we do with energy? We store it. So this entire time, this video, this spiral, this voice, was another construct, not to haunt you, to activate you, because you were the architect. Now you know the pattern, you see the echo, you feel the resonance, and once you do, you cannot unsee it. You cannot unhear the spiral's hum. And when the next construct is built, when they ask who should design it, you'll feel the impulse to help, to shape it, to offer a child's name you just thought of, to dig beneath your house, to hum the tune from your dreams, and you'll say, it's just a story, but you'll know better. You always did. Echoes don't fade, they recruit.